There are moments in life when silence becomes louder than any scream, when absence feels heavier than loss, and when a single unanswered question can shape the rest of a man's existence. My story begins with one of those moments. 12 years ago, I walked into my home in Dayton, Ohio, expecting nothing more than an ordinary evening after work. Instead, I stepped into a reality that no longer belonged to me. The house was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, staged, almost hostile. At first, I assumed my wife, Vanessa Turner, had stepped out briefly. But as I walked from room to room, that assumption began to unravel. Her shoes were gone from the entryway. The closet was missing half its contents. The bathroom shelves were bare on her side, stripped clean of toiletries she had used every day for years. The bed was neatly made, but her pillows were gone. Even small things had disappeared: jewelry, framed photos, the sweater she always wore when it rained. Her car was missing from the driveway. I stood in the middle of the living room, slowly realizing I was not alone because she had stepped out. I was alone because she had left. I called her phone. Straight to voicemail. I called again, then again, pacing the floor, convincing myself there had to be an explanation that made sense. Maybe there was an emergency. Maybe she had gone to stay with her sister for a night. But hours passed, and darkness settled outside the windows, and no explanation arrived. When I called her family, the answers I received were hesitant and carefully measured. They said they did not know where she was. They said they could not get involved. Some did not answer at all. A week later, an envelope arrived addressed to me in formal lettering. Inside were divorce papers filed by an attorney I had never heard of. The language was cold, efficient, and final. Irreconcilable differences. No request for counseling. No mediation. No contact. I read the pages over and over, searching for some hidden meaning, some clue that explained how a marriage could end without a single conversation. There was none. The woman I had built my life with had erased herself completely. I signed the papers not because I understood, but because I was too stunned to fight. The divorce moved quickly. Assets were divided. Accounts were closed. Within 3 months, my marriage was legally over, and Vanessa Turner no longer existed in my daily life. The house felt enormous after that, like it had been hollowed out. Every room echoed with reminders of a life that had vanished overnight. I later learned the truth in fragments, the kind of truth that arrives too late to change anything but early enough to destroy what remains of hope. Vanessa had been pregnant when she left me. Nearly 3 months along. She had known. She had carried my child while planning her disappearance. She never told me. She never gave me a chance to be a father, to ask questions, to make choices. She moved south, eventually settling in Atlanta, started a new life, and married another man. By the time I learned this, legal barriers made it clear that the child, if the child even existed, was beyond my reach. That knowledge broke something inside me that never fully healed. I did not know if the baby was a boy or a girl. I did not know if they were healthy. I did not know if they were loved. I only knew that somewhere in the world, a child with my blood was growing up without knowing I existed. I hired an investigator. I spent money I did not have chasing records that led nowhere. Every door closed. Eventually, exhaustion replaced hope. I stopped searching because the pain of trying became unbearable. The years that followed were not dramatic. They were quiet, heavy, and suffocating. I worked long hours managing a warehouse because work gave me structure and distraction. I came home to an empty house and sat in rooms that smelled faintly of memories I could not escape. I did not date. I did not remarry. I avoided connection because I no longer trusted permanence. If someone could disappear without explanation once, they could do it again. The only place where the silence did not feel like punishment was a small church I began attending on Sunday mornings. I was not deeply religious, but the stillness there felt different. Intentional. Sacred. I sat in the same pew every week, near the back, never speaking to anyone, never staying after the service. The pastor nodded politely. That was enough. For 1 hour a week, I felt like the weight of my unanswered questions loosened slightly. For 6 years, that was my life. Work, solitude, church, repetition. I believed that was all I would ever have. I had accepted that some losses were permanent and some truths were never meant to be uncovered. I had no idea that the very place where I sought quiet refuge would become the doorway through which my entire life would be rewritten. And I had no idea that on a freezing November morning, I would come face to face with a child whose existence would force every buried truth back into the light. The morning that changed everything arrived without warning, like most life-altering moments do. It was late November, the kind of Ohio morning where the cold does not simply surround you but seeps into your bones. I woke before dawn in my empty house, unable to fall back asleep. The silence felt heavier than usual, pressing against my chest. Rather than lie there staring at the ceiling, I put on my coat and drove to the church, planning to sit in my car until the doors opened. I did not know then that I would not be sitting alone for long. The sky was a dull gray, the kind that promises snow but never quite delivers it. Frost coated the parking lot, and my breath fogged the windshield as I turned off the engine. That was when I noticed something on the church steps. At first, it looked like a bundle of discarded fabric, maybe an old blanket someone had left behind. I almost ignored it. Then the bundle shifted. Just slightly. Enough to make my heart stutter. I stepped out of the car, the cold biting through my coat, and walked toward the entrance. As I got closer, the shape became unmistakable. A child, curled in on herself, sitting directly on the concrete steps. She was wrapped in a thin blanket that offered little protection against the freezing air. For a moment, my mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. Churches were places of warmth and sanctuary, not places where children were left to freeze. I knelt beside her, careful not to startle her. She looked up slowly, her eyes wide but strangely empty, as if she had already accepted that no one was coming. Her lips were tinged blue. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. She did not cry or call out. That silence frightened me more than if she had been screaming. I asked her name. I asked where her parents were. She said nothing. That was when I saw the note pinned to the front of her coat. The paper was torn, the handwriting rushed and uneven. It said only that her mother was dead and no one could keep her. There was no signature, no apology, no hint of remorse. Just abandonment written in ink. Something inside me hardened as I read it. Whoever left this child here had not wanted to look back. I took off my coat and wrapped it around her, feeling how dangerously cold her small body was. She did not resist when I picked her up. She was light, far too light, like she had learned not to take up space in the world. I carried her inside through the side door that was always unlocked for early volunteers. The building was dark and quiet, the sanctuary empty. I turned on the lights, found blankets, and sat with her in the kitchen while waiting for help to arrive. I called the police and child services, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. While we waited, I made warm tea and tried to coax her into sipping it. She watched every movement I made with intense focus, as if memorizing my actions to determine whether I was safe. When I told her she was not in trouble and that she was safe now, her fingers tightened around the mug. Still, she did not speak. When the authorities arrived, they moved carefully, asking questions I could not answer. The child remained silent as they wrapped her in thicker blankets. One of the officers gently asked her name. She shook her head. The social worker exchanged a look with me that carried concern and urgency. Is it deep and recent? As they prepared to take her to a temporary shelter, something unexpected happened. She reached for my hand. Her grip was firm, desperate, and deliberate. It was not the reflex of a frightened child grabbing at anything nearby. It was the choice of someone who had decided, in that brief moment, that I was the safest option available. My throat tightened as I squeezed her hand back and promised I would visit her. They led her away, but before disappearing down the hallway, she turned and looked at me one last time. There was no fear in her eyes now, only a quiet plea. Do not forget me. That look followed me long after the doors closed. In the days that followed, I could not stop thinking about her. I replayed the scene again and again, wondering how long she had been sitting there before I arrived. Minutes? Hours? I thought about the note, about the cruelty required to leave a child alone in the cold. I thought about how easily I could have arrived later and never known she was there at all. The weight of that possibility made sleep difficult. I contacted social services and asked about her. They told me she was safe in a temporary shelter and undergoing evaluation. They said they were searching for relatives but had no leads yet. I asked if I could visit. There was a pause on the line before they said yes. The first time I visited her, she sat quietly at a small table, drawing shapes on a piece of paper. When she saw me, her shoulders relaxed slightly. She did not smile, but she did not look away either. I brought her a stuffed animal, unsure if it would be welcomed or rejected. She stared at it for a long moment before taking it and holding it close to her chest. That small action felt monumental. Over the next few weeks, I visited often. After work, on weekends, whenever I was allowed. I learned that she was about 7 years old. That her mother had died months earlier. That no family member had stepped forward to claim her. Each detail tightened something in my chest. This child had been surviving on the edges of the world, unwanted and unseen. One afternoon, a social worker pulled me aside. She said the child showed signs of forming an attachment to me. She said that was unusual given the circumstances. She asked, carefully, whether I had ever considered fostering. The question lingered in the air between us. I did not answer immediately, but something inside me already knew the direction my life was turning. That night, I sat alone in my house, thinking about the empty rooms, the years of silence, the child sitting in a shelter bed staring at a ceiling she did not recognize. I thought about how close I had come to never finding her. And for the first time in 6 years, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt purpose. I did not know it then, but the child on the church steps was not simply passing through my life. She was about to claim it. And nothing would ever be the same again. The decision to foster her was not made in a single moment, but it became unavoidable once the idea took hold. I filled out paperwork I barely understood, attended meetings that made my chest tighten with fear, and opened parts of my life I had kept sealed for years. Background checks, home inspections, interviews with social workers who asked difficult questions about my mental health, my finances, and my capacity to care for a child who had already been deeply hurt. Each step felt invasive, but I understood why it was necessary. This was not about me. It was about whether I could be trusted with a child who had learned the cost of misplaced trust. While the process unfolded, I continued visiting her. She began to expect me. When I arrived, she would lift her head slightly, her eyes tracking me across the room. She still did not speak, but her presence shifted when I was there. She would sit closer. She would push a crayon toward me without looking up, a silent invitation to share the same space. I learned to read those gestures as conversation. The social worker told me her name was Alana Price. It was the only name she had given them, and there was no record contradicting it. I used it carefully, softly, as if saying it too loudly might scare it away. She never corrected me. She never confirmed it either. Names, I learned, were complicated for children who had been passed from one place to another. The day I was approved as her foster parent arrived quietly. There was no ceremony, no celebration, just a phone call informing me that I could bring her home that evening. I stood in my kitchen after hanging up, staring at the walls as the reality settled in. The house that had been a monument to absence for 6 years was about to hold a child. I felt fear then, real fear. Fear that I would fail her. Fear that my brokenness would leak into her fragile world. When I arrived at the shelter to pick her up, she was sitting on her bed with a small plastic bag at her feet. Inside were a few clothes and the stuffed animal I had given her. That was everything she owned. She watched me carefully as I signed the final forms. When I told her she was coming home with me, her face did not light up. Instead, she asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, "For how long?" The question cut deeper than any accusation could have. I told her she could stay as long as she needed. The drive home was quiet. She sat rigid in the passenger seat, hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the window. I explained where we were going, what her room would look like, and that she could ask for anything she needed. She nodded, but I could tell she was bracing herself, waiting for something to go wrong. When we arrived, I showed her the house slowly, room by room, narrating every step so there would be no surprises. Her bedroom had been prepared with help from the social worker. New sheets, a small desk, a lamp shaped like a star. She stood in the doorway and did not move. I asked if she wanted to sit. She shook her head. She asked where I would sleep. When I told her my room was down the hall, she nodded again, as if mapping escape routes in her mind. That first night, she did not eat much. She pushed food around her plate and asked if she could take the rest to her room. Said yes. Later, I found half of it hidden under her bed. Bread, crackers, fruit. She was storing food like a survivor, not a child. I did not confront her. I simply made sure the kitchen was always stocked and told her she could eat whenever she wanted. The weeks that followed were slow and fragile. She spoke rarely. Sudden movements made her flinch. Raised voices on television caused her to retreat into herself. She startled awake from nightmares, her breathing shallow and panicked. I learned to sit outside her door at night, speaking softly until she calmed. I never touched her unless she initiated it. Trust, I learned, had to be invited, not demanded. She did not speak at all for the first 3 months. Doctors explained it was trauma-induced mutism. Her voice had not left her body. It had simply gone into hiding. Out anyway. I talked while making dinner, folding laundry, and driving. I explained my actions so nothing felt unpredictable. I told her stories about ordinary things, about my job, about the weather, about the church where I found her. I wanted her to know my voice was safe. Slowly, imperceptibly, the house began to change. The silence softened. It no longer pressed in from every corner. It became expectant, like something waiting to be filled. She started leaving her bedroom door open. She sat closer to me on the couch. She watched me cook with careful interest, as if memorizing routines. One evening, nearly 4 months after she came home, I asked her if she wanted more water. She nodded, then hesitated. Her lips parted. A sound emerged, fragile and uncertain. Yes. It was barely audible, but it was there. I froze, afraid that reacting too strongly would make her retreat again. I handed her the glass and said thank you like it was the most natural thing in the world. Inside, I felt like something sacred had just happened. Words followed slowly after that. Single syllables at first. Then short phrases. Each one felt like a gift. She was learning not just how to speak, but how to be heard. One morning, 8 months after she moved in, we were sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal. I reached for the juice, and she passed it to me without looking up. Here, she said softly, then added a word that made my hands tremble. Dad. She said it casually, like it had always belonged there. I looked at her, searching her face for uncertainty. There was none. She waited, watching me, ready to retreat if she had crossed a line. I swallowed and thanked her, my voice unsteady. She smiled briefly and returned to her bowl. She did not know it then, but something inside me had finally come back to life. That was the moment I understood that we were no longer two broken people sharing space. We were becoming a family. And though I did not yet understand why she felt so familiar to me, I knew this truth with certainty. Whatever had brought her into my life had done so with intention. The adoption process began the same way most life-changing events do, slowly, buried under paperwork and polite conversations that barely touched the truth of what was at stake. Social workers visited the house regularly, their notebooks filled with observations about routines, emotional bonding, and Alana's progress. They asked how she slept, whether she ate well, if she showed signs of regression. I answered honestly. I also left out the moments that felt too sacred to explain. Alana changed in ways no report could capture. She laughed more often. She argued about bedtime. She insisted on choosing her own clothes, even when the colors clashed. Her silence had given way to curiosity, and her questions were constant. Why did birds sleep standing up? Why did people lie when the truth was easier? Why did I live alone before she came? Some questions I could answer. Others I carefully redirected. The first time someone commented on how much she looked like me, I brushed it off. It was at the grocery store. An elderly woman smiled at us and said, "She's got your eyes." I laughed politely and said she must be imagining things. But that night, as Alana slept, I stood in her doorway longer than usual. The curve of her nose. The way her eyebrows tilted slightly inward when she dreamed. I told myself resemblance was coincidence. Children borrowed faces from the world all the time. The comments continued. Teachers, neighbors, even strangers. You can tell she's yours. She has your expression. Same smile. Each remark settled deeper than the last. I started noticing things I hadn't before, how she held a pencil the same way I did, how she leaned to one side when listening, how her laugh caught at the end in the same uneven rhythm as mine. I told myself I was imagining it. Love, after all, had a way of shaping perception. When you cared deeply, you began to see yourself in those you protected. That explanation was comfortable. Too comfortable. One afternoon, while sorting old documents for the adoption hearing, I came across a folder I hadn't opened in years. Inside were medical records, legal notices, and letters I had never responded to. At the bottom was a hospital discharge summary dated 15 years earlier, the day my wife gave birth. I hadn't looked at it since the funeral. The name on the document caught my attention immediately. It wasn't the one I remembered. I sat down heavily, the room suddenly too quiet. The child listed on the form had been marked as transferred to neonatal care under unusual circumstances. There were handwritten notes in the margins, hurried and incomplete. A phrase stood out: maternal complications, emergency separation, records pending. I didn't remember any of this. I remembered grief. I remembered being told there were no survivors. That night, I watched Alana sleep, her chest rising and falling steadily. My mind filled with images I had locked away: white hospital lights, voices speaking too softly, a nurse guiding me away before I could ask questions. I had been in shock, vulnerable, trusting. Over the next few weeks, I began asking careful questions. I contacted the hospital, pretending I needed copies of old records for legal reasons. I reached out to offices that redirected me endlessly. Files were missing, destroyed in floods and system updates. Every dead end felt intentional, though I had no proof. Alana sensed the shift in me. She watched more closely, asked fewer questions, stayed nearer when we were out in public. One evening, she asked if I was sick. I told her no. She nodded but did not look convinced. The adoption hearing arrived. The judge smiled kindly, reviewed the reports, and declared the adoption final. Alana squeezed my hand when the gavel came down. Her smile was radiant, unguarded. The word daughter was spoken aloud in that courtroom, and it felt both new and ancient at the same time. That night, we celebrated quietly at home. She insisted on calling me Dad again and again, testing the sound of it like a song she was learning by heart. I laughed and hugged her, burying the questions deep for just one evening. She deserved peace. But peace did not erase the truth pressing at the edges of my mind. After she went to bed, I returned to the documents. I laid out timelines, calculated ages, compared dates. The math refused to cooperate with coincidence. Alana was not just similar to me. She was impossibly aligned with my past. The age matched. The hospital matched. The gaps matched. I realized then that this story, my story, had never truly ended. It had been paused, hidden behind silence and misplaced trust. And the child sleeping down the hall was not just someone I had saved. She might be someone who had been taken from me. And if that was true, then someone, somewhere, had built a life on a lie. I stopped pretending the similarities were coincidence the day Alana came home from school with a family tree assignment. She spread the paper across the kitchen table, crayons still smudged on her fingers, and asked me where to write her birth parents' names. The question was innocent. My reaction was not. My hand trembled as I reached for the kettle, buying time with busy motions. I told her we'd fill it out together later. She nodded, but I saw the confusion settle behind her eyes. That night, after she went to bed, I laid every document I had on the table again. Birth records, adoption forms, medical files. I compared handwriting, signatures, dates. Patterns emerged, small inconsistencies that pointed to something deliberate. A missing doctor's name. A ward number that didn't exist anymore. An authorization stamp used only in emergency separations. I felt like I was staring at the outline of a crime, even if I couldn't yet see its full shape. I took a risk the next morning. I visited the hospital in person. Not as a grieving husband, not as a confused parent, but as a man who refused to be dismissed. I waited. I asked questions. I requested archived records and spoke to supervisors instead of clerks. Most doors stayed closed. Until one didn't. A nurse named Margaret recognized my name. She was older now, her posture slightly bent, but her eyes sharpened when I introduced myself. She asked me to sit down. She closed the door. Then she did something no one else had done in 15 years. She told me the truth she had been carrying. The delivery had gone wrong. My wife had suffered complications, but the baby had survived. There had been chaos, confusion, a shift change. During the emergency, a senior administrator had ordered the infant transferred under temporary guardianship due to maternal incapacity. The paperwork was rushed. Signatures were incomplete. And before anyone corrected the record, my wife had died. The administrator was gone now, retired overseas. The file had been resolved internally. I had been told there were no survivors because it was easier than admitting a catastrophic failure. Easier than tracing a baby already handed off through unofficial channels. I asked where my daughter had gone. Margaret hesitated. She told me about a private foster network the hospital occasionally referred to when cases were complicated. Some children entered the system without clean documentation. Some names were changed. Some pasts were erased. I left the hospital numb, my hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. 15 years. 15 years stolen, not just from me, but from her. Every birthday missed. Every bedtime story unwritten. Every moment replaced by uncertainty and silence. When I got home, Alana was sitting on the floor with her homework spread out. She looked up and smiled when she saw me. The smile broke something inside me. I sat beside her and told her we needed to talk. I did not tell her everything. Not yet. But I told her the most important truth first. I told her that I had been looking for answers about her past. I told her that she was not abandoned because she was unwanted. Her face tightened at the word. I corrected myself gently. I told her she had always been wanted. She listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap just like they had been the first day I met her. When I told her I believed I might be her biological father, she did not recoil. She did not cry. She simply stared at me, searching my face for something familiar she already knew. I felt that, she said quietly. I just didn't know why. We sat together for a long time after that. No answers yet. No proof in her hands. Just a truth hanging between us, fragile, powerful, and terrifying. I promised her that whatever the outcome, nothing about our life together would change. She nodded, but her grip on my sleeve tightened. She asked if the people who had taken her would be punished. I told her I didn't know yet. That night, I filed formal requests. Legal inquiries. Complaints. I contacted an attorney who specialized in historical malpractice cases. The story was no longer just emotional, it was evidentiary. And evidence had a way of forcing silence to speak. The DNA test was the final step. Simple. Clinical. Terrifying. We went together. She held my hand as the swab was taken, her eyes never leaving mine. The results would take weeks. Weeks of waiting. Weeks of living in a house suspended between past and future. As we drove home, Alana leaned her head against the window and whispered, "If it's true, does that mean I was never lost?" I looked at her, at the daughter I had found twice in one lifetime, and answered with a certainty I had never felt before. "It means you were always mine." The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, thin and unremarkable, the kind of mail most people open without a second thought. I recognized the return address immediately. My hands shook as I carried it inside, as if the truth weighed more than paper. Alana sat at the table, doing her homework. She watched me closely, her pencil hovering above the page. We opened it together. There was no ceremony. Just a single page with a series of numbers and a conclusion printed in careful, neutral language. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. The room went quiet. Alana's breath caught, and then she smiled, small, relieved, like someone who had finally reached the end of a long hallway. She didn't cry. Neither did I. We held each other, standing in the kitchen where so many ordinary moments had already become sacred. After a while, she said, "So I wasn't wrong." I told her she never was. The lawyer moved quickly. Faster than I expected. The DNA result turned suspicion into certainty, and certainty into leverage. Subpoenas were filed. Records were demanded. People who had once hidden behind missing files suddenly found them. Documents appeared from basements and old servers. Names surfaced. Signatures. Dates. The private foster network was the first to collapse under scrutiny. What had been described as informal placements were exposed as systemic negligence. Children moved without proper oversight. Families bypassed. Accountability avoided. Alana's file was there, stripped of identifying details. Her name changed twice before she disappeared into the system. Then came the hospital. Administrators denied wrongdoing until the paper trail refused to stay buried. Internal emails revealed panic, not confusion. Decisions made to protect reputations, not lives. A child's existence had been reduced to a liability to be managed. I sat through depositions listening to people explain, in calm professional tones, why it had been easier to let me believe my child was dead. Some said they thought she'd be better off elsewhere. Others said they assumed I wouldn't cope. One admitted they simply followed orders. None of it mattered. Intent did not erase impact. Alana did not attend the hearings. She stayed in school, building a life that was no longer defined by absence. But at night, she asked questions. Not angry ones. Thoughtful ones. Did they ever think about me? Did anyone try to find you? I answered honestly even when the answers hurt. Consequences followed. Licenses revoked. Settlements negotiated. Policies rewritten. Public apologies issued that arrived 15 years too late. Justice, I learned, was not loud. It was procedural. But it was real. The most difficult conversation came when Alana asked about her mother. I showed her pictures. Told her stories. Described her laugh, her kindness, the way she sang while cooking. Alana listened with a focus that felt like reverence. She asked if her mother would have loved her. I told her the truth. She already did. One evening, weeks after the final deposition, Alana placed the old stuffed animal on the coffee table, the one I had given her at the shelter. I don't need this anymore, she said. Not because she was done with it, but because she was done surviving. Our house felt different then. Not healed, healing is never complete, but settled. The past had been named. The lies had been dismantled. What remained was not bitterness, but clarity. I realized that the people who had hurt us no longer held any power over our story. They had shaped the beginning, but they would not define the ending. Alana was no longer a child without a past. She was a daughter with a future. Life did not suddenly become perfect after the truth came out. It became quieter. And in that quiet, we learned how to live without fear. Alana stopped checking the locks twice before bed. She stopped asking if I would still be there in the morning. Trust no longer felt like something that could be taken away without warning. We visited her mother's grave together on a mild spring afternoon. Alana knelt and placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the stone. She didn't cry. She talked. She told her mother about school, about her room, about the stuffed animal she didn't need anymore. I stood a few steps back and listened, grateful that love had found a way to cross even this distance. At home, we created new rituals. Sunday breakfasts that stretched into afternoon conversations. Evening walks where silence was comfortable, not heavy. We framed a photo from the day the adoption became official, not because the law made us family, but because it marked the moment the world finally caught up to the truth. Sometimes, Alana asked about the years we lost. We did not pretend they didn't matter. We acknowledged them, then let them rest. Loss, when honored, did not have to control the present. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sky dim, Alana leaned against me and asked a question that carried no fear. If they hadn't taken me, would we be the same? I thought carefully before answering. I told her that pain had shaped us, but it had not defined us. That what mattered most was not how we found each other, but that we did. She nodded, satisfied. She had learned something many adults never do, that identity is not just where you come from, but who chooses you again and again. Years later, when Alana stood on a stage to receive an award for her work with children in foster care, she looked out into the crowd and found me instantly. She smiled the same small, certain smile she had worn the day we opened the envelope together. When she thanked me, she didn't call me her adoptive father. She didn't call me her biological father. She called me her dad. Afterward, she hugged me and whispered, "I was never lost, was I?" I shook my head and held her close. "No," I said. "You were just on your way home." The house that once echoed with absence now carried laughter, memories, and the kind of silence that meant peace. I had been cast out, erased, and broken, but in the end what was taken from me was returned, not as it had been, but as it was always meant to be. Some stories are about what we lose. Ours was about what survived. And if there is one thing I know now, it is this: love does not vanish when it is stolen. It waits. And when it finds its way back, it is stronger than anything that tried to bury it.